Historic places give us a view of the past, but they also help us understand the present and the future. That's one of the reasons for a new organization coordinating programs at two sites on the Freedom Trail, the Old State House and the Old South Meeting House. To tell us about new ways to engage with the history and to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre is the President and CEO of Revolutionary Spaces, Nat Sheidley. Thank you much for being with us, Nat.
Thank you for having me.
Matt, I know, and Nat, you were with originally the Bostonian Society, which was connected with the State House. I think of these buildings as two separate places, so what's the common denominator here?
The common denominator is that they both tell part of a larger story, which is the story of the transformation and how people get to have a voice in the laws that govern them. Each organization or each building, the Old State House and Old South Meeting House, tells a part of that story, and it's really the tension between the two buildings during the Revolutionary period that expresses fully what that transformation was all about.
Of course, just the names, Meeting House to me suggests, town meeting democracy. Whereas the Old State House was originally the seat of British rule, but I guess it's not as simple as that.
No, it's not. I mean, I think we can, it's helpful to think about the revolution as one long, extended American conversation about representation, which can sound like a dry as dust civics lesson, or it can sound like a series of fundamental questions we still grapple with today, right? How do I get to have a voice? How am I heard? What's my recourse if my voice is silenced? What do we mean when we say we the people? Who gets to be part of the body politic? Think about the Old State House as a place where many of those conversations unfolded between elected representatives and those who voted for them. But there were a whole bunch of people who didn't get to have a vote, right? And in many cases where they gathered was in Old South Meeting House, which was the largest indoor gathering place in revolutionary Boston. So that's where popular politics took place, and it's really the tension between popular and formal politics that gave rise to the movement that ended with American independence.
Well, in the mid to late 1700s, there was this tension between expanding the British Empire and who gets to pay for that, who has to pay for that, and I guess that really hit home hard here in Boston.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it's sometimes hard for us to fathom how unexpected the revolution was, though. I mean, if you went back to 1765, just a few years after this huge imperial war between Britain and France that Britain won, it felt in Boston sort of like it did in America after the end of the Cold War, right? Oh my goodness, this era of war and horrible fighting that we've been experiencing, it's finally come to an end. We have a whole era of peace and prosperity to look forward to, and then just 10 years later it's fallen apart. And one of the reasons that it falls apart is because of the pressure of expansion, sudden expansion of all of those territories that have been conquered by France. But I think the lesson there for us today is just how rapidly things can turn and how important it is to sustain an ongoing conversation about our core values and about what it really means to be part of one common body politic.
But of course, if people are used to that at a town meeting, all of a sudden Parliament across the ocean says, well, you got to pay a tax on these things here because we need to raise some revenue. People don't like the way that feels. It's not just the material privation. They're losing control, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think we often make a mistake when we think that it was a war over taxation. It wasn't. It was a war over representation. And there was a concern that people in Boston elected representatives in their own community who should be voting on the taxes that governed them. Folks in Parliament, there was no representation from the colonies. But I think the important thing is we miss the point if we think that this is really just about Boston or Massachusetts or the American colonies on one side and Britain on the other, because there were folks here in Boston who didn't have the vote, and they began to wonder, well, if it's okay for the colonies to resist not having a voice in Parliament, what do I do about the fact that laws are being made to govern me that I don't have a say in? And that's the slippage that happens during the revolutionary years.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Nat Sheidley from Revolutionary Spaces. Now, take a few steps outside the State House. A few years later, maybe, we have a skirmish in the street. A few people get killed. It sounds like a minor event, but why was the Boston Massacre so important?
Well, I think the Boston Massacre is, it comes to play a role in the way in which the colonies construct the memory of what it means to be a British subject, right? So it's important to remember that the British soldiers that fired into a crowd of civilians on the night of March 5th, 1770, were our own soldiers, right? Bostonians saw themselves as British subjects at that moment. Their town had been occupied by British soldiers for a year and a half, and that had created a lot of friction. But in some ways, what makes it so poignant is that the soldiers firing into the crowd are, many of them, married to Boston women. They have children who are growing up in the town. They have been integrated into the community. So imagine everyone in Boston, a town of 15,000 people, knew someone lying in the street after the shots were fired, but they also knew the soldiers who had fired on them. And it's in remembering the aftermath that firm lines are drawn between colonists on the one side and Britons on the other. So it's in the remembering that we really shape the impetus for independence.
And the soldiers had defense attorneys from here too, didn't they?
Yeah, they sure did. John Adams ends up defending the soldiers and is very happy throughout his life to tell a story about the importance of standing up for the law, right? It's important for the legal system for all people to have adequate representation, and it was an act of courage on his part to stand up for the soldiers, which I think is partly true, but it's not the whole story.
Now, the other thing that was clear, and I guess this goes back to contemporary representations of the event, this was there was racial diversity involved here too, with Crispus Attucks being the first victim.
That's right. So one of the victims who falls, the first one, eyewitnesses believe, was a man named Crispus Attucks, although he was known as Michael Johnson at the time. He was a self-liberated former slave of mixed African and Native ancestry, like many people in Massachusetts at the time, having that mixed ancestry. It's not hugely remarked upon at the time, although Adams makes mention of it in the trial. But I think it's important for us to recognize that later generations of Americans and Bostonians returned to Crispus Attucks as a focal point for telling the story of what the revolution was really all about. So black abolitionists lift him up as a hero during the 1840s and the 1850s, and civil rights leaders here in Boston throughout the 20th century have continued to call attention to the importance of Crispus Attucks. So it's part of our ongoing conversation about who we as a people are here in Boston.
Well, on March 5th, you have the anniversary itself. You've got some events, and I guess this is where you really roll out the new synergy here. So what's this going to be like?
Yeah, so the Revolutionary Spaces is committed not just to using public history to help people understand the past better, but to use that history as a lens to help us understand the world that we live in today better, and as a tool to help us fashion a more just and more equitable future. So what does that look like for our commemoration of the Boston Massacre? Well, it means a whole year of programs that will kick off on March 5th with a big speaking program at Old South Meeting House that will be keynoted by Governor Baker and others. But it continues throughout the year with public art and plays and public conversation. And the goal here is really to continue the conversation that began during the Revolutionary period about what we mean when we say we the people, right? So we're trying to honor the tradition of those black abolitionists and civil rights leaders who used the memory of the massacre to advance that conversation, right? Pointing to Crispus Attucks to say that there's a space in the body politic for people of all backgrounds, and really trying to expand the circle of we, which, as we know, was very limited at the time of independence itself. That's really the arc of our American story, is continuing to return to that question. What do we mean when we say we the people? And find a better answer, find a more just answer for our own time. So we want to put the public history programming that we're doing forward for the people of Boston as an opportunity to come together and to continue that really important work as citizens together in this city. What do we want our city to look like in the future? Who owns a claim to our story, our founding story? In 2026, we're going to be commemorating the 250th anniversary of American independence. And we want to use this year's anniversary to begin a conversation with Boston about what the story is that we want to be telling as a city in 2026 when the whole nation's eyes are on us.
What are details and schedules here? So if people want to find that online, is there a place they can go?
Yeah, revolutionaryspaces.org is our website, and you can find more information there. We're just launching it right now as a new organization, so there will be more coming on an almost daily basis, so we encourage people to check back often.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Nat Sheidley from Revolutionary Spaces.